Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 15th September 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson, of course. And we're delighted today to be joined by David Scott of Northern Exposure. And of course, David reports from north of the border. Well, it's a really great day, Mike.
It is a fantastic day, Brian. It is, in fact, I should say to everybody, happy International Day of Democracy. This is the International Day of Democracy today. And the 2017 theme is all about democracy and conflict prevention. So I thought we'd start off the programme just by, we'll go into more detail on this a little later in the programme, but I thought we'd start off the programme by going through the mainstream media and just briefly having a look at how the media is helping to prevent conflict around the world.
Helping the British government, of course, because the British government is sole agenda is to prevent conflict.
Absolutely. So, of course, the big news from today is that North Korea has carried out another missile launch, and Jens Stoltenberg calling for a global response to that. There's an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council taking place this morning, most of the mainstream media went nuts about it. So BBC, I thought this was a perfect place to start. North Korea fires second ballistic missile over Japan. And along with quite a number of other mainstream media outlets, they went into great detail, showing nice pictures of what kind of missiles North Korea has. The fact that these missiles don't have any operational guidance systems or that they tend not to work more often than they do. That's neither here nor there. We've got to be extremely scared of this extremely dangerous regime.
It's a really excellent graph, isn't it, put together to show the increasing scale of the threat.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. The Daily Express gets the clickbait headline of the day: World War III, North Korea preparing for battle as Kim Jong-un declares quasi-war status. Okay.
It's brilliant.
Yep.
And I'll just say, isn't it remarkable, the North Koreans, as a relatively small country, they can produce their own missiles. These are real missiles, and they are getting them into the air. We could discuss whether they're working, but they're not digital. They're not like UK going for digital weapons.
Absolutely, absolutely. But North Korea, as you say, they've got some real weapons. South Korea, though, because in order to prevent conflict, we've got to keep the pressure on. South Korea is talking about sending a decapitation unit, squad.
Democratic
decapitation unit, that's right. Apparently, according to this independent article, the unit has not been assigned to literally decapitate North Korean leaders. But that is clearly the menacing message South Korea is trying to send. Defense officials said the unit would conduct cross-border raids. Is a cross-border raid not an act of war?
Not if it's part of the world democracy agenda.
Right, okay. With retooled helicopters and transport planes that would penetrate North Korea at night.
Wow.
Yeah. Rarely does a government announce a strategy to assassinate a head of state, but South Korea wants to keep the North on edge and nervous. Why would you do that if you wanted to prevent conflict?
I would have thought that South Korea, that has experienced all the horrors of the Korean War, the last thing the South Koreans would actually want is another war in Korea.
Absolutely.
And fueled, of course, by the Americans and the British.
Absolutely. But don't worry, because North Korea is going to expand its influence, and it's going to help Iran develop nuclear weapons now, because, of course, Iran is another on the target list, so we've got to make sure that we can expand.
They're linked together.
Absolutely, absolutely. But, David, it gets even better, because, as you noticed, the Indian army is now preparing for a 2.5 front war.
Yes, two fronts is simply not enough. 2.5 fronts means simultaneous war with China and Pakistan and against internal insurgents. So, and this is going to be no problem for the Indian Army. They're all prepared. Well, most are prepared. Well, we're getting prepared. The story changes a little bit. I'm not sure what the purpose of this is to be. Is it to annoy your neighbours? Is it to terrify your own population? Is it to get more money from the government for the military? Who knows? It's certainly a very striking article.
That was a pretty bold statement. Could you just run me through that again? He's happy for a simultaneous war with the Chinese.
Yes.
And
the most populous nation on earth, yes, nuclear armed. and the Pakistanis, the country they've had 2 wars with,
Yes.
and who are nuclear armed, and a simultaneous internal war against insurgents.
Well, and I think we should get the Indian Army over to the UK as quickly as possible to help train our military in Sandhurst, because we seem to be having a few problems even getting soldiers dressed properly.
Well, we'll come on to that shortly. And just to end this section, we're sort of making light of the coverage of this, I suppose. But to end this section, India has conducted its first live fire exercise of a homegrown BVR, that's Beyond Visual Range, air-to-air missile. So they are ramping up their capability as well. But,
Well, again, we can say here, Mike, isn't it remarkable that these other countries are able to build their own equipment? And I'm certainly not mocking what the Indians are capable of, but here in UK, of course, we're told we can't build anything without the help of the French or the Americans or the Germans or the Italians. David?
An interesting comment on that Indian Times article. India has a buy Indian policy for its defence procurement. Imagine that.
Imagine that.
Just imagine that.
Yeah.
Well, if that's what other overseas military are up to, here at home, we're into Newspeak, and we've got the Philip Jones, Lord Admiral, head of the Royal Navy. He's been talking about having to trim platforms to pay for a technology surge. Now, this is very interesting language, because I think a platform means a ship, but it's not entirely obvious because he's just said platforms. But I'm sure that Michael Fallon, the illustrious British Defence Minister...
Minister of War, please.
Minister of War, said that we were actually going to have more ships. The Navy was growing.
It is, yes.
But the head of the Navy says, well, actually, it's not going to grow because he's going to lose some platforms.
I think I can explain this.
Okay.
It's growing at a certain rate. It's just shrinking faster.
It's shrinking faster, okay. Well, the Newspeak is all there, because this is what the man actually said. He said, over time, innovation could deliver the Royal Navy truly transformative advances in capability, and the Royal Navy might have to sacrifice a few platforms to pay for it. So it's innovative, it's transformative, it's actually jam tomorrow, I think is the correct description. So we're worried about the Chinese, we're worried about North Korea, we're worried about the Russians, but we're going to solve the problem by cutting a navy which is already barely capable of doing the job, in order to have transformative high technology platforms in the future.
It doesn't just apply to the Navy, Brian, because the Army is also getting transformative high technology bits and pieces.
Good.
And in this case, it's actually their uniforms. And you can see them on screen here. They're looking very fetching. Well, I suppose this is combat gear rather than uniforms, but this is a partnership between the Ministry of Defence and the Royal College of Art, who have collaborated on a future concept for Army combat uniform to show at this week's Defence and Security Equipment International 2017 event.
So we haven't got the regiments, we haven't got the heavy armour, we haven't got the equipment, but not to worry because the colleges are helping with the uniforms.
But the College of Art.
College of Art.
It's not a military college, it's a College of Art, so apparently we're going to paint them or something, I don't know. But anyway, the Future Soldier Vision apparently is part of the Ministry of Defence's plan to give British soldiers high quality cutting edge equipment, and the Royal College of Art's researchers and designers have worked on the clothing to ensure that prototypes were fitted to the body properly, easy to run in, comfortable to wear. And they supplied a number of sets of prototype combat clothing, which were assessed by the Specialist Weapons School at Warminster.
Wow.
Yeah.
Are these going to be unisex? So the girls are going to have to put up with flies, or are the boys going to have to take their trousers down?
It's hard to say, but apparently it includes four-way stretch phase change material and silent hook and loop pockets. Okay.
It's getting increasingly difficult to put out the UK column news with a straight face.
Yes, before I ask David to comment, I just want to show what Harriet Baldwin, the procurement minister, had to say. You might not expect the Ministry of Defence to work with an art and design university, but it's this kind of non-traditional partnership which will keep our armed forces equipped with cutting-edge technology.
And before you take that off screen, that must be jungle camouflage she's wearing.
I think it is. David?
I'm astounded at the flippant approach the two of you are taking to this. This has got a fine history of this sort of association, because as you may not know, Hugo Boss designed the uniform for the SS. So there you go.
Not really sure how to answer that one.
No, we're not. We'll just leave it there. But on the subject of the military, of course, we must bring in Britain's police force, because Britain's police are being increasingly militarised. We can see this in the uniforms, we can see it in the training, we can see this in the behaviour, and of course we can certainly see it as more and more weapons come online. Now, last night with Ian Crane, we covered aspects of policing in Britain, but I just wanted to put this slide up on screen. This is Sergeant Tangy from Devon and Cornwall Police. He's recently won an award for being the best tweeting policeman. I think that's in the country. He was paid to go over to California in order to talk about the use of social media to carry out policing. So he enjoyed the sunshine and the drinks out there with his American colleagues. But of course, he's a weapons trained officer. And if you have a look at his Twitter page, which I encourage you to do, this man seems to me to be obsessed with weapons and playing what I've described as a RoboCop here. So these are just some of the pictures that he's posted. He's also tweeted about being in cars going to robberies that weren't actually robberies, but doing virtually twice the legal speed limit. And this is how he sees himself, and Devon and Cornwall Police very happy for him to spend his time sending out thousands of tweets. So there we are, there's a RoboCop. We're not sure what actual policing that man does. This is a real policeman, and this is the Metropolitan Policeman John Wedger. And I can tell you that John, who was brave enough to start exposing the cover-up of the abuse of children in London and the deaths of children associated with that abuse in London, has been harassed, bullied, threatened ever since. And of course, he spent a lot of time over the last couple of years on no pay. He's trying to leave the police, but the Met Police are busy blocking his application to leave and retire. But what's been happening over the last couple of weeks is that he's now being regularly stopped, often by armed police in their car. So presumably that would be the style of Sergeant Tangy. The style of course, he's not directly involved. But this is really shocking stuff. A policeman that does his job to help protect children is now threatened and intimidated by Metropolitan Police. And of course, there can only be one explanation for this, and that is that the police themselves have been involved in the abuse of children, and they're now being used by the front-end political establishment to try and silence or warn off John Wedger because of the information he holds. If you're not familiar with the excellent interview that John did, must be over a year ago now.
Well over a year.
Well over a year. You can go onto the UK column and listen to that audio interview. But what a difference in these policemen. One man taking huge risks on the streets of London to try and protect children. The Devon and Cornwall policeman playing being RoboCop. And what's his contribution to the protection of society? He's very good at tweeting. David, this is obscene stuff, and really the police need to be brought to task over this.
The point there you made about police being involved in the cover-up, this is something that we've come across many times. We came across it in the Doherty case, and there's more to be revealed in that front, and hopefully one year we'll be able to do that. We've come across it all across the country, that you have essentially two police forces. You have the police who are doing their job and who are protecting the public, and you have another police. We actually came across the term shadow police, who are operating within the force and who operate against and act against the honest policemen and women, and act to cover up the most heinous wrongdoing. And that's what we're fighting.
Yep. Okay, Let's move on. A couple of advertisements. A reminder of the next Media on Trial event taking place on Thursday, the 19th of October, 7 p.m. at the Bloomsbury Central Baptist Church, Shaftesbury Avenue in London. John Pilger speaking, Peter Ford, Patrick Henningsen, Vanessa Beeley, Piers Robinson, Robert Stewart, Tim Hayward. So get along to that if you can. And also on the 8th of October, a few days before, 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. AV 8.1, Ian Crane's sort of interim alternative view event, and you will be speaking at that. He will be speaking at that. Patrick will also be at that one. Dr. Graham Downing as well.
Yeah, and one of the things we discussed with Ian last night was that he felt the need to put on another event because of the speed at which we see events unfolding around us. But having described the conduct of Britain's police, let's remind ourselves that Britain is the source of democracy, I think.
Absolutely, and it is International Day of Democracy. Now, just as we said, the 2017 theme, Brian, is democracy and conflict prevention, and it focuses on the critical need to strengthen democratic institutions to promote peace and stability.
Good.
So,
where do we go? Well, let's bring in this headline because something really, really dangerous is unfolding, and we're going to spend a bit of time having a look at this. We're saying it's a new Tory drive for secret courts with an attack on free speech. Where is this actually coming from? Well, it's coming from this man, and we've taken this information from The Guardian because it's a very good article. What's Jeremy Wright QC, Attorney General, got to say? He says that our contempt of court laws are designed to prevent trial by media. However, are they able to protect against trials by social media? So we can see we're back on the old theme that when the general public talk to each other over the internet, the government is getting worried. So let's have a look at what's going on here. He says he's looking for expert evidence on whether the increasing influence and ubiquity of social media is having an impact on criminal trials, and if so, whether the criminal justice system has the tools it needs to manage that risk. What do you think he's saying there, Mike?
He's saying that he's scared of social media and he wants to shut it down as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think that's about fair. So he goes on. Every defendant in this country is entitled to a fair trial where a verdict is delivered based on the evidence heard in court. And I've added to that, except where, of course, they block that evidence from ever reaching the court. And where are they especially good at doing that? Well, of course, they don't want any evidence coming into the trials of child abuse survivors like Melanie Shaw. They don't want proper evidence and truth in the family courts or high-level state corruption cases. Those have to be carried out in secret. So this is utter hypocrisy from this man, but it goes on. He says, I'm not approaching the issue with any preconceptions about whether there's a need to change the law. Judges, lawyers, police, victims' organisations, journalists and human rights groups are being approached for comments. So he's started this with a totally open mind, Mike. Just no preconceptions at all. Stay with it. We have to keep a balance between the principle of freedom of speech and the integrity of the trial process. What I want to see is how broad the concerns are. Then we can start to think about the issues. I want to see whether judges have the tools required, whether they are crying out for some new powers or changes in the law. So he doesn't have any preconceived ideas, but he thinks that possibly some judges are crying out. Well, let's go back to the source article. Here was the headline with the picture. Attorney General begins inquiry about social media impact on UK trials. And how did all this start? Mysteriously, by this. The initiative follows recommendations by the senior appeal court judge Sir Brian Leveson, following legal challenges over what could be published about the trial of two schoolgirls who were eventually convicted of murdering Angela Wrightson. So he doesn't have any preconceived ideas. He thinks that possibly judges may be crying out. And, oh dear, the judge who's crying out happens to be Sir Brian Leveson.
Who failed to get control of the press.
Failed to get control of the press. I'm glad you picked that up. I'll just add this in and we'll get David to comment. Of course, we already have the Contempt of Court Act 1981, which sets out what can be published before and during a trial. It is contempt of court to publish anything that creates a, quote, substantial risk that the course of justice in the proceedings in question will be seriously impeded or prejudiced, even if there's no intent to cause such prejudice. So, David, this is really dangerous stuff now. We're going to have social media, the internet, the general public talking to each other under attack because, well, why?
Well, look what the social media is doing. The social media has allowed victims of, for example, child abuse by senior and well-connected people to find one another, to launch a campaign. Why was all of this stuff completely unknown in the 70s and 80s when it was most certainly going on? Well, there was no means of communication. The internet's changed that. He's talking about judges wanting to close down social media. A judge we covered about a week ago was Sheriff Andrew Lothian. He was involved in such things as assaulting his wife, visiting strip clubs, and assaulted other nefarious activities. And he was eventually after decades, allowed to resign. Now, that sort of judge would want to have social media closed down. That sort of judge wouldn't want pesky members of the public poking their noses around his affairs to see if he was actually fit for the job. But the interests of justice do require these things, do require openness. Sunshine is the best disinfectant, as they say. So it's very concerning, and also there's a political aspect because the authorities are losing control of the political narrative. Trump's election, Brexit, all of these things were against the official line, the official mainstream media line. And part of the reason that happened was the alternative media and the internet simply went a different way, and the people were not buying what was being sold.
But I think one of the interesting points here, Brian, is, as you said, from that article, there's already legislation in place.
This is the old story, Mike.
And it was the same with the Leveson inquiry. This was one of the points that people were trying to make during the Leveson inquiry as well. The legislation was already in place to deal with all the issues that the inquiry was there to investigate. And yet it was felt there was a need for additional powers and additional rules. So you've then got to ask why don't they just use what's there?
Well, because I believe, and David can correct me, but I believe they don't use what's there because actually what's there does not take them where they want to go. They are seeking a complete close down. They're seeking a dictatorship that would make North Korea look silly, and the existing legislation can't hack that. So we've got to bring in the new legislation, and what they're going for is a close down. Let me go on a little bit more on this subject. Of course, Leveson has come in. Let's remind ourselves, Leveson, where did Judge Leveson come from? Well, of course, David Cameron put him in charge of the investigation into the media, but that was all stirred up by the political charity Common Purpose. Never think that charity's gone away, still very powerful in the background and now working overseas. But Common Purpose stirred up the angst against the media, created the Media Standards Trust and the Hacked Off campaign. And then when the fire was burning, David Cameron appoints his chum, Lord Justice Leveson, in order to run the inquiry. And it was quite unbelievable. Sir David Bell of Common Purpose, of course, was brought in to be one of the senior members on Leveson's panel. So this was all exposed by the UK column. It was later followed up by the Mail, and the Guardian did actually cover a bit. The Telegraph certainly did, but the lead on this came exclusively from the UK column. So we had the Leveson inquiry. And then what was the follow-on from that? Well, of course, we had all of these agencies and bodies being created who were going to make sure that the press towed the party line and did as they're told. Now, you've had some approaches, Mike, I think, from one of these organisations that was trying to see whether UK Column would get involved.
Well, Impress was very, very keen for us to decide to be regulated by them, but I'm not sure. I think that was mainly because they are suffering so much from having nobody signing up and paying them their fees that they are...
Impress Billy No Mates.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. So on screen, we've just put up two quite comprehensive diagrams showing all the people who were involved in this massive attack on free speech in British press and media. That attack is now going on. Leveson as a judge still at the heart of it. Remember, he was simply appointed by David Cameron. Theresa May in the chair now. But let's go on and see what the Attorney General has to say. He says the scope of the inquiry could also extend to any problems caused by archived media content, old stories that remain easily accessible via the internet, as well as the dangers jurors face if they research trials they are hearing online. This is close to book burning, in my opinion.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what he's basically saying is we're particularly concerned that people are becoming too good at doing their own research. We don't want people to do their own research and come to their own conclusions. They've got to follow the narrative that we feed them. Yeah. Therefore, we've got to remove the content that's in the archives on the internet so that we take away the ability for people to do their own research.
Yeah, let's forget all about everything that was said about Leon Britton, for example. Didn't really count. Let's get that off the internet. Let's get all the stuff off about Ted Heath that's on the internet. So we should bring in Theresa May because, of course, we've reported over the last couple of days that she's been working to take control of very important cross-party committees. And what she said, these are her words, what we're doing is ensuring the government's working majority is available across the business in Parliament. So Tory party taking control of Parliament. This is a coup. There is no doubt about it. An attack on free speech in the media, an attack on the way Parliament should work. This is a coup. And we are saying, as David has just said, the real story is the Tories are now pooping their panties because the general public are digging up the truth and facts for themselves and sharing that knowledge on the internet. Theresa May wants that stopped. And I've said that she's also, I'm going to say it, she's also wetting herself because Wiltshire police are going to produce a report onto their investigation into Ted Heath's child abuse. And the Tories don't want that information spreading on the internet for the general public to read and understand. So we are now going to bring in laws in order to sanitize the internet. This is a dictatorship in the making, David. It is so obvious what's going on here. When are we going to see the mainstream papers, the journalists waking up to this reality?
I don't know the answer to that. You asked a wee while ago why existing laws aren't used. I'm seeing this as well. I think the reason is this. The existing laws have the DNA of Magna Carta, of trial by jury, of liberty running through them. The further you get away from that starting point, the less secure that becomes. But even though we might be using laws that date from the 40s or 50s or 60s, they're still sufficiently rooted in something honest that they can't be manipulated as is desired. So that's why new laws have to be created. And I'm also struck by all of this demand to make sure that the courts are happy with everything. Well, there's no demand to make sure that the people are happy. There's no demand to say let's have a root and branch reform of how we're prosecuting cases because of what happened with Jana and all of the abuse and all of the evidence that was against him for the child abuse that was buried, that was just swept under the carpet, and it was never prosecuted until he was too old and too frail to stand trial, and then admitted, it's been a terrible mistake. That there's no demand there for let's make some changes, let's make some new laws. It never seems to work in that direction.
No,
Indeed.
absolutely. Okay, David, let's move on to Scottish issues and a diary of injustice in Scotland. This is Peter Cherby's blog, and we're starting off here with the Crown Office. And what he's saying is that senior figures at the Crown Office put a secrecy block on publication of their own register of interests after journalists uncovered a host of conflicts of interest by Crown Office staff, including links to disgraced solicitors and suspended judges, unrecorded meetings with ministers and members of the judiciary, business connections and interests of Crown Office staff, and dumbed down criminal convictions of prosecutors still working for the Crown Office. He's not mincing his words, David.
He's not, and I really encourage people, if you want to see what's running the country, look out this blog. It's actually one blog. It could be 6 or 7 major articles in the mainstream papers if the mainstream papers had the courage to print it. It goes through a whole series of things. Not only does the Crown Office have a secret list of the connections and interests of their prosecutors, but we, the public, are not allowed to know, and it's immune to FOI, apparently. But there's a whole series of connections. I'll just give you one to give a flavour of it. A Crown Office manager's stepson who worked part-time in the NHS and has a direct relative working in the same organisation was handed a lucrative Crown Office job with access to sensitive information without even an interview. The individual, identified as Peter Murphy, worked at the Crown Office for around 2 years and was then arrested, apparently on petition warrant, relating to the supply of Class A drugs. It was presumed that given the quantity of drugs involved, the case would be prosecuted at the High Court. But no, he received a community disposal at Sheriff Court level. And he was then allowed to resign without even being sacked. So that's the quality of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, the only prosecutor in Scotland. There's no private prosecution in Scotland. If you have any sort of criminal case, it has to go through the Crown Office. And this corrupt organisation is where the system is most dramatically in Scotland, dramatically breaking down. That's a wonderful article, and I encourage people to seek out the detail on that. It's really first class.
And of course, another reason for the Crown Office to refuse publication of the Register of Interests, well, this is going back to March 2016. The Sunday Mail here, that's the Daily Record, isn't it? Reported that the brother of the then Lord Advocate was at the centre of, well, what was being described as a probe into financial shenanigans of some kind.
Well, yes, this is the brother of Frank Mulholland. Now, he was the Lord Advocate who personally, we understand, instructed the most recent arrest and prosecution of Robert Greene. And in Scotland, there's an enormous amount of leeway given to the Lord Advocate to essentially run the place. He also has a seat in the cabinet, so you're talking an extremely important and very, very powerful position where all criminal prosecution and all investigation of death is ultimately controlled by one man. So you can imagine the potential for corruption there. And yes, his brother was involved in a half £500,000 mortgage for a rogue lap dance bar magnate, and it was all quite shady. And of course, you're not allowed to know about all these links, and the links are everywhere, with crime, with suspended lawyers, with people on both sides of the legal profession, so that prosecutors and judges, for example, might be related. There are links everywhere.
Right, and well, this one from the Scotsman that you want to highlight: Nicola Sturgeon pledges to seek answer over empty baby coffin. What was the background to this?
This is a 40-year campaign. A 40-year campaign that this mother, who was shown her dead baby, and it wasn't her baby, wanted to know what had been buried in the grave that was marked for her baby's remains. And it took 40 years of fighting to get the coffin exhumed. And when it was exhumed, it was empty of remains. There was a name, there was some clothing, but there was no baby, no remains of a baby, no decomposed remains, nothing. And she wants to know what happened to her child. And this follows on from the baby ashes scandal, where there's considerable concern over what was happening to the corpses of babies in publicly run
crematoria.
Crematoria in Scotland. And this was investigated by none other than Dame Elise Angelini. And it was all a terrible misunderstanding, you'll understand, and there was no actual wrongdoing, and it was quite understandable, and there was nothing to see here. But it was terribly badly handled, so we're very sorry. But there's no actual wrongdoing.
And what chance do you think this lady has that Nicola Sturgeon will actually turn up any answers?
Well, zero. There's no interest in Nicola Sturgeon in turning up answers. What there is an interest in offering the pretense, offering the appearance of doing the right thing. Because to do the right thing, what happened to that child? Well, whatever happened to that child, and there's a couple of possibilities. Someone has to go to jail, and there's probably a long chain of people who are involved in covering it up.
Yeah.
I do not believe there are political leaders, Nicola Sturgeon, Theresa May, or any of them, have the courage to actually get in and find out what's happening in this country and really lift the lid. Because what are you lifting the lid on? You're lifting the lid on the establishment, you're lifting the lid on people who are extremely well connected, who maybe put you in that place. This is where democracy, it's Democracy Day, democracy contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction through corruption in large part.
Yeah. And Brian, this is another story which echoes a similar story in Ireland, actually.
Indeed it does. It's talking about abuse of children at a particular orphanage, but there's now been a mass grave found, a series of reports which I'll let David comment on, but there's no crime.
There's nothing to see here. The BBC and the Times assures us there's no crime here.
Sorry,
No.
we should mention the name of this, of course, shouldn't we? This
Smillian.
is Smillian.
Yeah.
Yes, this is Smillian Home in Lanarkshire, and this was run by Roman Catholic nuns, and it was operating from a very long time. 1864 it opened to 1981, during which 11,600 children passed through this institution. Now, there was a secret mass grave. There's a mass grave with over 400 children's bodies in it, unmarked. And from 2003, former residents of this children's home were campaigning to get this uncovered and to find out what had happened. And the people who originally campaigned actually died before this was found out. But eventually, and they found out that there was more than 400 corpses, 400 sets of remains. Now, many interesting things about that. The records show 158. It's been the law in Scotland since 1855, before the home opened, that all deaths have to be recorded. But there's 250 plus unrecorded dead children here. Now, we're told it's okay because most of these children died of natural causes. Now, a couple of things about that. This echoes the former Soviet Union. When Glasnost was coming in, they had a television program in the Soviet Union where people could phone in and ask questions of the head of the KGB. And someone phoned in and said, I've been looking at the numbers that were killed by the KGB, and I've been looking at the figures, and I reckon it's about 45 million. Is that correct? And he answered that, well, I couldn't possibly say, but I'll come back next week and I'll confirm the figure. So that next week, that the whole of Russia tuned into this program to find out what their own history was. And the head of the KGB said, yes, 45 million is about correct, but it's ridiculous to say that these people were killed. Most of them died of natural causes. And this is quite right. If you don't look after people, if you put them in Siberia and work them to death and don't give them enough to eat and put them in cold and insanitary conditions, they tend to die of natural causes. So the idea that most of these unrecorded graves of children died of natural causes means there's nothing to see or investigate is shocking.
Yeah.
And, David, just to interject there, somebody has just posted, and I think it's a very astute comment in our chat box. They've said that, of course, if a grave of 400 children was to be found at the moment in North Korea, that would be that would be war. We would
That would
go
be
to
proof-
war on the
proof
basis that
if
those
any were
nasty.
needed. Yes,
Yeah, well-
absolutely. That would prove the case that the North Koreans were evil beyond belief,
But
and,
here
and
with
give us cause. Now we're now talking about the Scottish Government is going to consider bringing in a burial inspector for the mass graves. So we're considering it. So we'll watch this space closely.
Yep. So we've got the Westminster government consistently covering up the abuse and deaths of children. We've got similar activity going on north of the border, and yet we've got the United Kingdom under Theresa May, Conservative politician, lecturing countries overseas on their standards of democracy and justice. The hypocrisy is breathtaking.
Well, here's an excellent example of democracy in action to end on. This is from The Guardian. Revised UK child sexual consent rules provoke backlash. Now, this is about the Criminal Injuries Compensation Agency, which gives out money to people that have been affected by criminal acts. And as we've reported over the last week or so, some people, particularly people who've been affected by the abuse that was taking place in Rotherham, have had criminal injuries compensation refused on the basis that they allegedly consented to what was happening to them. And I just wanted to take a couple of quotes from the guidance, because The Guardian has now seen the guidance which is used by the Criminal Injuries Compensation Agency to make their decisions. So we're going to end up with a pretty obscene story actually here, because here is what the guidance says. The revised guidance states that victims of child sexual abuse can be disqualified from the scheme on the basis that consent in fact is different from consent in law. Now, of course, we've got to remember that there's no judicial procedure has taken place. There's no guilt has been proven against any perpetrator as such. So these people are not acting on the basis of a guilty verdict. They're making a judgment on whether somebody deserves to be compensated for a criminal act. The guidance goes on to say, even in cases involving children, it says that where sexual activity is truly of the applicant's free will, no crime of violence will have occurred. How are they possibly making a judgment on whether somebody who was abused as a child, whether that abuse took place with the free will of the child or not?
After grooming or psychological threats? Yeah, what occurred?
So this is a spectacular situation where somebody who is otherwise eligible for compensation for having been the victim of this type of crime is in fact removed from that possibility, disqualified, because somebody some time later, 20 years later or 40 years later, decides that actually the applicant took part in the activity as an act of free will. That is an appalling situation.
Yeah.
David?
It really is shocking. Remember here, this is when you're looking at the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority, you get different results because it's the civil standard of proof. It's the balance of probability. But to move the idea of consent, I'm really speechless. I just think that's one of the most profoundly creepy things I've seen in a long time.
David,
and it relates to this move towards normalising paedophilia and towards suggesting that in practice the age of consent is not actually 16. It's something more like 12 or 13 for all practical purposes in this country now.
David, sorry to come in there, but of course I remember very well that we had Jack Straw as Home Secretary at one stage trying to make it unlawful for children in children's homes who were being abused to actually speak out to the media, and everybody said, on what basis would this be? But of course there can only be one reason you would do this, to facilitate the cover-up of abuse. Well, that's my personal opinion.
Yeah.
Yes, and cover-up of abuse that's on an industrial scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we're at the end for our time slot today, so we'll say what an extraordinary news it's been. World Democracy Day. We see the UK, of course, working particularly with the Americans ramping up pressure wherever it is in the world. North Korea is the latest for treatment, but at home we're seeing the true vile nature of our government and its agencies. We're at the stage where our children are also under attack, and it's up to all of us to do something about that. Now, just to end on a positive note, we were with Ian Crane last night. One of the things Ian was talking about was that there was a crowdfunding taking place in order to help people fight through the courts against these huge fracking companies. Remember, of course, that you don't even get near justice in UK unless you can pay for it. So many people say, what can we do? We will shortly, or next few days, put up details of this particular campaign.
Well, we don't need to wait that long because we're going to show that programme immediately after this one. So anybody that's watching on the UK Column website can get details of that campaign in a few minutes' time.
Okay. A total of £15,000 needs to be raised. I think it was about £3,500 so far. But if you're somebody wants to help, but you can't get out, you can't do particular things, or you don't want the stress of getting at the front end near the courts, there are other very brave people prepared to do that, but they need support and they need funding. But we're being told by the government the power of the internet. If we want to fight this vicious structure, we have to keep free speech going. We have to keep the internet open for alternative, truthful, factual, alternative news reporting. It's up to us. David, thanks very much for joining us. We will be back at the same time on Monday, providing the Attorney General doesn't get us, Mike.
Indeed.
Indeed. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.